calf cries for help to save his pregnant mother. His reaction shocked everyone. If you're enjoying this story, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and comment, telling us where you're listening from. The summer sun was setting over the riverina plains of New South Wales, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, when station hand Riley Cooper heard a sound that made his blood run cold. It was a calf's cry, but not the normal bawling of a young animal separated from its mother. This was desperate, terrified, unrelenting. The kind of sound that spoke of genuine distress. Riley had worked on Warrumbungle Station for 3 years, long enough to know every sound the cattle made, every rhythm of the land. He was checking the eastern paddock's water troughs when the crying started, coming from somewhere beyond the ridge where the terrain dropped away into a steep gully carved by centuries of seasonal water flow. He climbed into his ute and drove toward the sound, the vehicle bouncing over the rough ground. As he crested the ridge, what he saw made him slam on the brakes about 50 meters down the slope. Near the dry creek bed that ran through the gully, a cow lay on her side, clearly in distress. Standing over her was a calf, perhaps 6 months old, and he was doing something Riley had never witnessed in 15 years of cattle work. The calf was running back and forth between his mother and the ridge, crying out with increasing desperation. Every few minutes, he'd run up the slope toward where Riley's ute was parked, bellow loudly as if calling for attention, then run back to his mother and nuzzle her frantically. The pattern repeated over and over, unmistakable in its purpose. The calf was asking for help. Riley grabbed his radio and called back to the station. "Boss, it's Riley. I've got a situation in the eastern gully. Cow down. Looks like she's trying to give birth, but something's wrong. There's a calf here, and you're not going to believe what he's doing." Station owner Graham Walsh's voice crackled back. "On my way. Don't approach if she's calving. She might be aggressive. It's not that. This calf, he's actively trying to get attention, running toward me, calling out, going back to his mum. Graham, I've never seen behavior like this." Riley carefully made his way down the slope, watching the cow for signs of aggression. She was a Hereford cross, one of their breeding stock, her belly swollen with her pregnancy. But she wasn't moving, wasn't responding to Riley's approach. Only her eyes moved, tracking him with an expression that Riley would later swear showed relief mixed with pain. The calf, instead of running from the approaching human as most young cattle would, ran directly toward Riley. He stopped just a few meters away, crying out, then turned and ran back to his mother, looking back as if to say, "Follow me, help her." Riley knelt beside the cow, his experienced hands moving over her body, checking for injuries. What he found made his stomach tighten. The cow had somehow gotten her rear leg caught in old fencing wire, probably remnants from decades-old boundary repairs that had been buried and forgotten. The wire had wrapped around her leg as she'd tried to free herself, cutting deep into the flesh. She'd clearly been struggling for hours, probably since morning, and exhaustion had finally forced her down. But that wasn't the only problem. Riley could see signs of active labor. The cow was trying to give birth, but in her current position, trapped and lying on her side on uneven ground, the calf inside couldn't be delivered safely. Without intervention, both mother and unborn calf would die. "Easy, girl," Riley murmured, stroking the cow's neck. "We're going to help you. Just hold on." The older calf, the one who'd been crying for help, pressed close to his mother's head, making soft sounds now, as if trying to comfort her. Riley recognized him as one of the spring calves, born about 6 months ago. This cow was his mother, and somehow the young animal had understood that she needed help beyond what he could provide. Graham Walsh arrived 15 minutes later with the station veterinary, Dr. Sarah Mitchell, who'd been at the property checking on another animal. Sarah took one look at the situation and immediately began organizing. "We need to sedate her enough to work, but not so much it affects the unborn calf." Riley, I need you to set up lights. This is going to take time, and we're losing daylight." As they worked, more station hands arrived. Word had spread about the calf's remarkable behavior, and several workers had driven out to witness what was happening. The young calf stayed close throughout, watching every movement with intense attention. "I've worked with cattle for 30 years, Sarah said, as she prepared the sedation, "and I've never seen a calf demonstrate this level of understanding." He knew his mother needed help. He knew to call for humans. That requires abstract thinking. We don't usually attribute to cattle this young. The sedation was administered carefully, just enough to dull the pain and allow them to work. Riley and another stockman, Miguel Santos, carefully cut away the wire while Sarah monitored the cow's vital signs and prepared for the delivery that was now imminent. "The calf inside is still alive," Sarah announced, her hand on the cow's swollen belly. "I can feel movement and the heartbeat strong, but this is going to be difficult. She's been in labor too long, she's exhausted, and this position is all wrong." "Can we move her?" Graham asked. "Not safely, not in her current state. We work with what we've got." Sarah's face was grim but determined. "Riley, Miguel, I need you to help me reposition the calf inside. This is going to hurt her even with the sedation, but it's the only way." What followed was an hour of intense, delicate work. Sarah had to reach inside and manually reposition the unborn calf, whose front legs had folded back instead of extending forward as they should for a normal delivery. Every adjustment caused the mother to groan in pain despite the sedation, and each time she did, her older calf would press closer, making soft, comforting sounds. "The calf's trying to soothe her," Miguel observed, his voice filled with wonder. "Look at him. He's staying right by her head, talking to her." Riley Sy, who was holding the portable light so Sarah could see what she was doing, had to wipe away tears with his shoulder. He'd grown up on cattle stations, had seen thousands of births, hundreds of difficult situations. But this level of emotional connection between mother and calf, the obvious distress the young one felt seeing his mother in pain, it was breaking something open in his chest he hadn't known was there. "Got it?" Sarah finally said, her voice tight with concentration. "The legs are extended now. We can try a pull. But we need to be gentle. This calf's been stressed too long already." Graham and Miguel positioned themselves to assist with the pull while Sarah guided the process. It took 3 attempts, each one carefully timed with the cow's weakening contractions, before the newborn calf's head appeared. 2 more pulls, and suddenly the tiny body slid free, landing in the straw they'd laid out in preparation. For a terrible moment, the newborn didn't move. Sarah immediately began clearing its airways, stimulating it to breathe, while everyone held their breath. The older calf, who'd been watching everything, took a tentative step toward his new sibling, his eyes wide. Then the newborn gasped, coughed, and let out a weak but unmistakable cry. The sound seemed to galvanize the mother cow. Despite her exhaustion and sedation, she lifted her head and made a low, rumbling sound of recognition and relief. "She knows," Riley said, his voice rough. "She knows her baby's alive." The older calf approached his new sibling cautiously, sniffing the wet, shaking bundle that was trying to figure out what its legs were for. Then he did something that made every person present stop and stare. He began licking the newborn, helping to clean and dry it in the same way his mother would have if she'd been able. "That's maternal behavior," Sarah said, her professional demeanor cracking as emotion showed through. "He's taken on a caretaking role. That's not typical for male calves, especially not at 6 months old. They don't usually show interest in newborns at all." They worked for another hour to finish treating the mother's wire injuries, administering antibiotics and pain relief, making her as comfortable as possible while they waited for the sedation to wear off. The older calf never left his mother's side, alternating between checking on her and returning to the newborn, who was gradually getting stronger. As full darkness fell and the portable lights cast strange shadows across the gully, Sarah made her assessment. "We can't move her tonight. She needs to recover from the trauma and the sedation before we attempt to get her up the slope. I'll stay here to monitor her. If her vitals remain stable, we should be able to move her to the cattle yards by morning." "I'll stay too," Riley volunteered immediately. "Can't leave her out here alone." Graham nodded. "I'll send someone back with camping gear and supplies. The newborn's going to need colostrum if the mother can't nurse right away." But as it turned out, nature had other plans. Around midnight, as Riley and Sarah dozed in turns while monitoring their patient, the mother cow began struggling to her feet. The sedation had worn off, and despite her injuries, maternal instinct was overpowering everything else. It took several attempts, her injured leg barely taking weight, but she finally stood. Immediately, she turned to her newborn, who was sleeping curled against her older calf. The mother made a soft, deep sound, and both calves responded. The newborn struggled to its feet on wobbly legs, and within minutes, guided by instinct and the older calf's gentle nudges, the baby found its mother's udder and began to nurse. Riley and Sarah watched in silence as the family unit established itself. The mother, despite her pain and exhaustion, stood patiently while her newborn fed. The older calf positioned himself on the other side of his mother, as if standing guard, his earlier desperate cries replaced by quiet vigilance. "We just witnessed something extraordinary," Sarah said softly. "Not just the rescue, not even the birth. But that calf," her voice caught slightly. "That 6-month-old calf understood his mother was in danger, understood that humans could help, actively sought out that help, and then took on a caretaking role for his sibling. That's a level of cognitive and emotional development we simply don't expect from cattle." "What do we call him?" Riley asked. "A calf like that deserves a proper name." "Guardian," Sarah suggested, "because that's what he is. His mother's guardian, his siblings' guardian. He saved them both today." Word of Guardian's remarkable behavior spread quickly through the agricultural community. Local news picked up the story, then regional outlets, and finally national media. Footage captured on phone cameras by the station hands showed Guardian's frantic calls for help, his gentle care of the newborn, his constant attention to his mother. Animal behavior experts from universities across Australia requested permission to study Guardian and his family. Dr. James Wu from the University of Sydney's Veterinary School drove out to Warrumbungle Station 3 days after the rescue to observe Guardian firsthand. "What we're seeing here challenges fundamental assumptions about bovine cognition," Dr. Wu said. Watching Guardian interact with his mother and new sibling in the recovery yard, the ability to understand that a situation requires help beyond what the animal can provide, the decision to actively seek human intervention, and then the assumption of a caretaking role. These are sophisticated behaviors that suggest cattle may have far more complex emotional and cognitive lives than we've credited them with. Graham Walsh, who'd run Warrumbungle Station for 25 years, found himself in an unexpected position. His cattle station, which had operated in quiet obscurity for decades, was suddenly receiving visitors from around the country. Researchers, journalists, even school groups wanting to see the miracle calf who'd saved his mother. "Never thought I'd be running a bloody educational centre alongside a cattle operation," Graham told Riley one morning as they watched yet another university vehicle pull up the long driveway. But if Guardian's story helps people understand that cattle are more than just livestock, more than just meat and milk, then I suppose it's worth the disruption. The mother cow, whom the station hands had started calling Grace in honor of how gracefully she'd endured her ordeal, made a full recovery. Her leg wound healed cleanly, though she'd always have a slight limp and impressive scars. The newborn, a female that Riley named Hope, thrived under her mother's care and Guardian's continued watchfulness. It was the relationship between Guardian and Hope that particularly fascinated the researchers. Dr. Wu set up cameras to record their interactions, documenting behavior that had rarely been studied in cattle. Guardian has essentially appointed himself as Hope's secondary caregiver. Dr. Wu explained during one of his presentations to Graham and the station staff. He stays close when she explores, intervenes if she wanders too far, and positions himself between her and anything he perceives as threatening. That's sophisticated protective behavior that demonstrates not just attachment, but a sense of responsibility. The footage Dr. Wu showed was remarkable. Guardian could be seen gently nudging Hope back toward Grace when the curious calf wandered too far. When Hope tried to approach the fence where curious visitors gathered, Guardian would step between them, creating a barrier. At night, he positioned himself so that Hope was protected between his body and Grace's. What's even more interesting, Dr. Wu continued, is that Grace actively encourages this relationship. She allows Guardian to take on this protective role, trusts him with her newborn. That suggests she recognizes his earlier efforts to save her, understands that he's a reliable caregiver. We're seeing evidence of memory, gratitude, and trust operating across what we thought were purely instinctive relationships. Riley, who'd been Guardian's primary human contact since the rescue, noticed other changes in the young bull's behavior. Guardian had become notably calmer, more focused. While other calves his age engaged in playful butting and running, Guardian was always aware of where Grace and Hope were, always ready to respond if they needed him. "It's like he's matured 5 years in 5 weeks, Riley told Sarah during one of her follow-up visits. "He's still young, but there's something different in his eyes. He's taken his role seriously and it's changed him." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "Responsibility does that. In humans, we talk about how caring for others can accelerate emotional development. Perhaps the same is true for cattle. Guardian experienced a crisis, took action, and successfully protected his family. That kind of experience would shape any sentient being." The story of Guardian, Grace, and Hope reached beyond agricultural circles. Animal welfare organizations began using the case to advocate for better treatment of cattle, arguing that animals capable of such complex emotions and relationships deserved more humane handling. Several meat processors reached out to Graham, asking if he'd be willing to discuss welfare improvements based on what had been learned from Guardian's behavior. "I'm a cattle farmer," Graham said during one such meeting. "I raise animals for beef production. That's the reality of this industry. But watching Guardian, understanding what he did and why, it's changed how I think about the animals in my care. They're not just units of production. They're thinking, feeling beings who form bonds and experience emotions." These conversations led to Graham implementing new practices on Warrumbungle Station. Calves were no longer separated from their mothers as early. Family groups were kept together longer. The handling of cattle became gentler, more patient, with workers trained to recognize and respond to individual animal personalities. "Guardians taught us that cattle are individuals," Graham told his stockmen during a training session. "Some are bold, some are timid, some are natural leaders. We need to work with those personalities, not against them. Stress makes everything harder, makes animals less healthy, makes our jobs more dangerous. Respect and patience make everything better." The changes didn't just improve animal welfare, they improved productivity. Calves that stayed with their mothers longer, were healthier, required less medical intervention. Cattle that were handled calmly were easier to work with, reducing injuries to both animals and humans. What had started as an emotional response to Guardian's remarkable behavior was proving to have practical benefits. But perhaps the most significant change was in the people who worked with the cattle. Riley found himself talking to the animals more, paying attention to their individual quirks and preferences. Miguel started learning about cattle psychology, reading research papers in his spare time. The entire culture of the station shifted from viewing cattle as commodities to understanding them as complex individuals deserving of consideration and care. Guardian himself seemed unaware of the revolution he'd sparked. He continued his self-appointed role as Hope's guardian, watched over Grace with gentle attention, and gradually began to integrate back into the normal activities of a young bull. But there remained something distinctive about him, a quality that visitors remarked on immediately. "That calf has presence," one journalist observed, watching Guardian stand calmly while Hope nursed and Grace rested. "You can see intelligence in his eyes. He's not just existing, he's thinking, evaluating, making decisions." 6 weeks after the rescue, Dr. Wu returned with preliminary findings from his research. The data showed definitively that Guardian's behavior couldn't be explained by instinct alone. The sequence of actions, the problem-solving involved, the emotional regulation required, all pointed to cognitive processes far more sophisticated than previously documented in cattle. "We're proposing a long-term study," Dr. Wu told Graham during a formal presentation of his findings, following Guardian, Grace, and Hope through their lives, documenting their continued relationships and behaviors. "With your permission, of course, this research could fundamentally change how we understand cattle cognition and emotional capacity." Graham looked out the window of his office at the paddock where Guardian, Grace, and Hope grazed peacefully together. The afternoon sun turning their coats to copper and gold, on one condition: whatever you learn, whatever you publish, it has to make a real difference for cattle, not just academic papers that sit in journals. Real, practical changes that improve how cattle are treated across the industry. "That's exactly what we're hoping for," Dr. Wu assured him. "Guardian's story has already opened doors that were closed before. People are listening, willing to reconsider long-held assumptions. We have a chance to create genuine change." The research partnership that developed over the following year brought Warrumbungle Station international recognition. Dr. Wu's team documented dozens of instances where Guardian displayed remarkable cognitive abilities: problem-solving when Hope got stuck in a fence corner, communication with Grace through subtle vocalizations and body language that the researchers had to use specialized equipment to detect, recognition of individual humans and differential responses based on past interactions. But it was an incident 8 months after the rescue that truly captured global attention. A bushfire threatened the region, and evacuation orders were issued for several properties. Graham and his team worked frantically to move cattle to safety, loading them into trucks bound for a friend's property 50 kilometers away. Guardian, Grace, and Hope were among the last animals to be evacuated. As Riley approached to load them, Guardian did something unexpected. He positioned himself between Riley and Hope, making a specific vocalization that Riley had learned meant distress or warning. Then Guardian ran toward the eastern boundary, stopped, looked back, and bellowed. "He's trying to tell us something," Riley said, climbing back into his ute. "I'm going to check." What Riley found at the eastern boundary explained Guardian's behavior. A group of cattle, about 15 head, were trapped against a fence line by fallen trees from an earlier storm. They couldn't move forward or backward, and with the fire approaching, they were in immediate danger. Riley would never have found them in time if Guardian hadn't alerted him. He remembered, Riley told Graham afterward, his voice shaking. 8 months ago, he needed humans to save his mother. This time, cattle needed saving, and he knew to get human help. He's learned that humans can solve problems that cattle can't, and he actively uses that knowledge. The incident made international news. "Miracle Calf Saves Herd from Bushfire" ran the headlines, accompanied by footage of Guardian's deliberate communication and the subsequent rescue of the trapped cattle. Animal cognition researchers from 3 continents reached out, eager to study this remarkable case. Guardian was now 18 months old, well past the age where most beef cattle would be sent to market. But Graham had made a decision months earlier that Guardian, Grace and Hope would remain on Warrumbungle Station permanently, retired from commercial production. They'd become, in effect, research animals and ambassadors for cattle intelligence. "Some people think I'm being sentimental," Graham told a television interviewer. "Maybe I am. But Guardian's worth more alive than he'd ever be as beef, not just in terms of research value, but in what he represents. He's proof that cattle are far more complex than we've given them credit for. That's worth preserving." The financial reality worked out better than Graham had expected. The publicity brought visitors willing to pay for educational tours of the station. Universities paid for access to Guardian and his family for research, and the improvements in cattle handling that Guardian had inspired increased productivity enough to offset the loss of 3 animals from the commercial herd. Riley, who'd formed a particularly close bond with Guardian, was offered positions at research institutions, opportunities to work on groundbreaking studies of animal cognition. He turned them all down. "My place is here," he told Graham, "with Guardian and the mob. Someone needs to be here who understands him, who can advocate for him, who remembers what he did and why it matters." On the 1-year anniversary of the rescue, Warrumbungle Station hosted an open day. Hundreds of people attended, including many of the researchers, veterinarians, and media who'd followed Guardian's story. Hope, now a healthy yearling, stayed close to her mother and Guardian, the 3 of them moving as a tight family unit even in the crowd. Dr. Wu gave a presentation summarizing the year's research findings. The data was revolutionary, documenting cognitive abilities in cattle that challenged decades of scientific assumptions. Problem-solving, abstract thinking, emotional memory, intentional communication with humans, all demonstrated repeatedly by Guardian under controlled conditions. But beyond the science, Dr. Wu concluded, Guardian's story reminds us of something we sometimes forget in our modern, industrial approach to agriculture. The animals we raise for food are individuals with complex inner lives, capable of love, fear, joy, and grief. They form deep bonds with their families. They remember kindness and cruelty. They think, they feel, they matter. That doesn't mean we can't raise them for food, but it means we owe them respect, humane treatment, and recognition of their sentience. As the sun set on the anniversary celebration, Riley found Guardian standing at the fence of his paddock, watching the departing visitors. Hope was nearby, grazing peacefully, while Grace rested in the shade. Riley climbed the fence and sat on the top rail, and Guardian approached, pressing his head gently against Riley's leg in the gesture of trust and affection that had become familiar over the past year. "You've changed the world, mate," Riley said softly, scratching behind Guardian's ears. "Maybe not the whole world, not yet, but you've changed how thousands of people think about cattle. You've made them see what I see when I look at you. An individual, a thinking being, a person in your own right. That matters, Guardian. That really matters." Guardian made a soft sound. The rumbling vocalization that Riley had learned meant contentment. Together, they watched the sun disappear below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, while Grace and Hope grazed peacefully nearby. A family unit that should never have survived, held together by one calf's remarkable intelligence and desperate love. Now thriving and teaching the world that animals are far more than we've ever imagined them to be. And somewhere in the gathering darkness, the next generation of farmers, researchers and animal advocates carried Guardian's story with them, inspired to create a future where the bonds between humans and animals were honored, where intelligence was recognized regardless of species, and where a calf's cry for help would always be answered with compassion and respect.